Welcome to the Back in Time podcast with Kyle and JD, where every week we jump into our DeLorean, cruise to 88 miles per hour, and travel back in time to review our favorite films. Every week we talk about current cinema, the latest trailers, and we pick a new favorite film every single episode.
But I need a nuclear reaction to generate the 1.21 gigawatts of electricity. 1.21 gigawatts!
Don't say that! Never say that! Goonies never say die!
We're the best, we're the beautiful, we're the only Ghostbusters.
Now, here's your host, Kyle Autry, and his co-host, JD.
Welcome back to the Back in Time podcast. I am your host, Kyle Autry, joined as always by my co-host, JD. JD, how are you today?
Dude, I am super pumped. We have such a great episode coming up today. We got a great guest for you guys. I am stoked about what's going on today.
Yeah, so we actually just wrapped up the interview with author Casein Gaines. He's written a book called Where We're Going, We Don't Need Roads, the Back to the Future trilogy, or the making of the Back to the Future trilogy. And I have to say, this is a really fun interview. We cover a lot of stuff from the book, but we also cover some stuff outside of the book, and we get his perspective on the Back to the Future franchise and where it might be going or where it isn't going in his view. You know, JD, what were some of the things that you want to mention, just teasing it a little bit before we jump into the full interview?
Yeah, no, this is obviously a topic that's near and dear to our hearts as podcast hosts, and hopefully to you guys as our audience. And to be able to really get a second level of a deep dive into both the making and the production, and what's going on behind the cameras and what goes into the creation of a movie. It's fantastic, and Casein is wonderful. And man, if you guys read his effing books, both Kyle and I checked his book out, and we will be reading more from him. I mean, this guy's a great storyteller.
Yeah, I'll throw some stuff out at the end, but yeah, you can follow him at Casein Gaines on Twitter. He has a Facebook page as well. You can go right to his website, which is caseingaines.com, and he has copies of all of his different books. So yeah, he's covered Pee-wee's Playhouse. He's covered A Christmas Story, as we're going to talk about today, Where We Don't Need Roads, Back to the Future, and then his latest book, The Dark Crystal, The Ultimate Visual History. So you can actually go on there. He'll autograph the books. Again, I read through the book in a matter of days. It's such an easy read, and it's full of behind the scenes photos. It's got a whole section of those, and it's worth getting your hands on. Okay, so without further ado, let's get to the interview and bring in author Casein Gaines. Yeah, so today on the podcast we have Casein Gaines. He is an author, director, educator, and pop culture historian. He is the author of We Don't Need Roads, the making of the Back to the Future trilogy. His most recent book, The Dark Crystal, The Ultimate Visual History, was published last year by Insight Editions and received a starred review in Booklist. Casein, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be on.
Yeah, so we're pumped to talk some Back to the Future. Yeah, I just randomly came across your book. I was going through the library, and it just happened to catch my eye out of the corner of my eye, and I was like, what's this? And I pull it up and I start thumbing through it, and next thing I know, I check it out. I read through it really quick. It's a great book full of information, and I was like, maybe he has a Twitter. So I get on the Twitter, and there you are. And next thing you know, we're exchanging messages, and now we're on the phone.
Well, the book has a cool reflective cover, so it's eye-catching. I'm glad it did the trick.
Yeah. Shout out to whoever designed the cover, because it really worked. It looked a little glisten. And I was like, oh, what's this?
Let me tell you, this is a really horrible story, but it's so appropriate. Maybe I shouldn't even be telling it, but I'm going to do it anyway. We had this other cover for the book, and we got frighteningly close to having to go with that other cover, and I was just mortified by it, and I kept trying to get them to change it, and they just wouldn't change it. And at the last minute, They said, well, if you're really unhappy with this cover, we can make a change and we can hire a new person to design the cover, but it's like a one-time thing. Like whatever comes back, we can't make any changes because we have to go to print. You have to, let us know now. Do you want us to scrap what we have and just throw caution to the wind, or roll with the one that we have? And I said, I really think we just need to. I'll roll the dice with whatever else comes out. And this new cover, which I just love, is the cover that came out. So you could, if you're really curious, you can Google around and you can find the old cover. But I think everyone will see there's a very big difference between the first cover and the second cover. No disrespect to the original designer, but it just didn't really suit the book that I had written, I think.
Okay. Yeah, that's an awesome story. I'll definitely be Google searching that later on to take a look. So give us a little background into your first memories of Back to the Future and when you first saw this film.
Yes. So, wow, I have to say, I hope this isn't hard for me because I wrote about this in the introduction to the book. My Aunt Stacy, who actually very recently passed away, unfortunately, but my aunt was the person who showed me Back to the Future for the very first time. I was sent home sick from school. I wasn't really sick, but I was pretending to be sick. And I was probably about 5 years old or so. And my aunt just had a ton of VHS tapes. I mean, I don't know if you guys did, but when I was growing up, I had a million VHS tapes and my aunt had a million VHS tapes. And some of it were things that she had taped from HBO and some of it were things that she had purchased. But she had the Back to the Future trilogy in a box set, and it came with this VHS called The Secrets of the Back to the Future trilogy. Wow. The first time the trilogy had been released all together in a package like that. And so she said, you should watch this. I think you'll like this. And I just loved it. I loved it from the second I looked at that VHS box and I saw that beautiful Drew Struzan one sheet, on the cover. And I was just fascinated by it. I had never seen a car like DeLorean. I'd never seen, I recognized Michael J. Fox from Family Ties, but I just was completely in awe of the movie from before the tape had left the sleeve. And I was so excited that when the movie was over, my aunt was able to say, well, do you want to watch the next one? And I was like, oh my God, another one? So, I mean, it's funny because a lot of real hardcore Back to the Future fans had to go through the torture of waiting to see all three. The very first time I saw Back to the Future, I was a kid and I saw all three back to back to back. And I've never forgotten that experience. It was just an amazing way to see the film for the first time.
That's great. So what drew you into actually writing the book then all these years later?
I was always amazed by the story of Back to the Future. And I didn't know all of the ins and outs. I mean, I knew, I'd seen the DVD special features and I had, read some articles online. I'd been to, it's now backtothefuture.com, but at the time it was BTTF.com.
Yep.
And I knew that there was another actor who was cast as Marty McFly. But I didn't really know all of the details surrounding it as I was growing up. And as I got older, I was kind of amazed that there was this film that was so incredibly successful and had remained successful continuously for 30 years. And there had never been a really comprehensive book written about it. Michael Clasterin wrote a book about the making of the Back to the Future trilogy back in, I want to say 1990 or 1991, which at the time that I was writing my book was the only book out about Back to the Future that really was doing this behind the scenes look. Michael has since redone his book as an Ultimate Visual History, which is just a beautiful, beautiful book. But that project really came about after I was already working on We Don't Need Roads. And so when I started reaching out to people like Bob Gale, who co-wrote the films and produced the films, and really the original concept really came from him. He was so excited that someone was embarking on this journey of telling the story. And so Bob Gale was really instrumental in helping me reach out to people like Lea Thompson, and I'd written a couple other books by that point, and so I was pretty resourceful myself in terms of getting a hold of like Huey Lewis and other people, and so that was really the genesis of the writing of this book and how I got started. I was just sort of amazed that no one had sat down to chronicle this bit of cinema history and cultural history, and I wanted to be a part of the solution to that.
That's great. I love that story. So when you get into actually scheduling interviews and doing all your research, like what was the most difficult part of that entire process for you?
Oh, the most difficult part of that process is always clearing the agents. I think clearing the agents and the managers. That's as I said, I've written a couple other books, and they're all kind of based on the entertainment industry. And I find that if I can get a hold of someone directly, I mean, a perfect example is Lea Thompson, who I had reached out to her publicist. I don't know if it's her same publicist, but I reached out to her publicist, and the publicist just sort of wrote back very quickly and said, she's very busy, and I mean, politely, but said that she's busy and she isn't really going to have time to do an interview. And when I said to Bob Gale, I'm having a little bit of a hard time getting a hold of Lea, he said, "Oh, don't worry about it." And within maybe a day or two, I had an email directly from Lea Thompson saying, I just spoke with Bob, and he gave me your email address, and when do you want to talk? And we had a wonderful conversation, and she was so incredibly gracious and accommodating. And I wrote something on Howard the Duck actually years later, and she was great to go back to, and was just as generous. But the point being that it's always just hard. It's hard because all of these celebrities have limited time. They have people that work with them that are responsible for sort of managing requests. And I understand that. I don't begrudge anyone who turns down an interview, but clearing the gatekeepers is definitely the most difficult challenge in doing something like this.
So who was the most challenging overall to really get down?
The most challenging was definitely Michael J. Fox, and ultimately I did not get Michael J. Fox. He's probably the only person who I really made a concerted effort to get and thought I would be able to get, but I wasn't able to. And unfortunately for me, he was in production on the Michael J. Fox show. He had that. So the whole time that I was writing the book, he was in production of the show. And then I had heard from his manager or publicist, reach back out to him in whatever month it was, let's say September. Reach back out to him in September because the show will be done. And when I reached back out, literally the morning that I reached out to him, that afternoon, the news had broken that his show had been canceled. And so he wasn't doing any media. He wasn't taking any interview requests. He wasn't talking to anyone, which I completely understand. And so ultimately, Michael's people, came back and said, are you still available to do an interview? He'd really like to do it. And the book was already done by that point, unfortunately. So Michael J. Fox and I just had, bad timing, about it. But he was, again, he was really accommodating. But the other person that sort of comes to mind is Tom Wilson, who played Biff, who I never got a hold of as well. But at the time, Tom Wilson wasn't really talking about Back to the Future. He's since done more interviews and does conventions and things like that. But he had gone through a very long hiatus of sort of not discussing his role in Back to the Future. So I kind of got caught up in that hiatus as well.
Yeah, does he still hand out the business cards when people ask him questions?
I hope he does. Yeah, that's like the stuff of like Hollywood lore, right? Like I hope he still does, even if he talks to people. I tried a million times to get a hold of Crispin Glover, but I never got Crispin Glover. But I sensed that I wouldn't. I knew that I would.
One of the questions I had for you was if you tried to reach out to Eric Stoltz.
Oh, I did. I mean, yeah. I really wonder I am so fascinated by the story of Eric Stoltz. I mean, I'm sure, if you read the book, I spent quite a bit of time on
I've got several questions about Stoltz coming up.
Oh, great. I'd love to talk about this. So I made a million attempts to get a hold of Eric Stoltz, and I knew that Eric Stoltz was never going to talk to me, but I just tried. I tried, and I just couldn't make it happen. But of course I tried. I mean, it would be malpractice if I didn't try. But Eric Stoltz is probably the person that I made the greatest effort to try and get a hold of, even more so than Crispin Glover. Because, and I read an interview with Eric Stoltz very recently, long since the book has been released, where he said he really has no recollections of working on Back to the Future at all. And I said, oh, come on.
Oh, yeah, come on now.
There's no way. I mean, you worked 6 weeks. If I worked at a Dairy Queen for 6 weeks, I'd have some recollections of it. I mean, like you worked on a film for 6 weeks. I can understand why he why he would say that he has no recollection, though, of course.
Okay. That's a perfect transition into my next question. And I really enjoy the part of the book where you get behind the scenes information on how Eric Stoltz parted ways from the production. Can you give our audience some insight into how Stoltz found out that he was getting replaced and when it actually occurred?
Yes. They were filming in Puente Hills Mall, which is in the film is Twin Pines Mall, later the Lone Pine Mall, of course. To answer this question, I actually need to rewind just a little bit and give some context to what's going on here. Please. So Eric Stoltz is not anyone's first choice for Marty McFly, except for Sid Sheinberg. And Sid Sheinberg, who I actually spoke to for this book, he was the former head at the time, and the head of the studio at the time. And Sid Sheinberg loved Eric Stoltz's contributions in Mask. He loved the job they did in Mask and said, this kid is going to be the next big, star. We need to cast him in Back to the Future. And Michael J. Fox was doing Family Ties at the time, and they would not release him from his duties to do Back to the Future. And so ultimately, they cast Eric Stoltz. And it was one of those cases of just bad casting. And I will say, I teach at a high school and I direct the theater productions at the high school. And sometimes as the person doing casting, you find yourself in a situation where you think, I'm going to give someone a shot. I'm sure that they'll be able to grow into a role. I'm sure that they'll be fine. I'm sure with, some rehearsal, some practice, some one-on-one time, they'll do better. And what I find 9 times out of 10 is they don't always, and you end up making life miserable for everyone by putting people in a situation where they don't have the best chance to succeed, if you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of the situation that Eric found himself in. It wasn't really his fault. I mean, he auditioned for a part and he was given a part that was just sort of not a good fit for him. And he knew it. He knew it as well. But, he was cast. So there was an opportunity to replace Eric with Michael. And because they could not stop production, they just tried to rework the schedule so that they would get more shots of Chris. If it was a scene between Marty and Doc, they would just film more of Doc and not really film as much with Marty, or film more with Lorraine and not so much with Marty, because they knew that they were going to have to reshoot it. And so Eric Stoltz worked up until the day that he was let go. And I believe it was Zemeckis who went into his trailer and told him that he was being let go. And Neil Canton, who was one of the producers, went in and spoke to Chris Lloyd and told him that Eric was being let go. The way the story goes, Neil, the producer, told me that when he said to Chris Lloyd, "We're letting Eric go," Chris Lloyd said, "Who's Eric?" And the reason was because Eric Stoltz insisted on being called Marty on set. And so Chris Lloyd did not actually know. Vulture actually asked Christopher Lloyd about this, if you remembered this. They referenced the book and said, "Do you remember doing this?" And he said, I don't actually remember asking who's Marty, but I will swear that Neil Canton did tell me that that's what Chris Lloyd said. And so,
wow.
With that being said, then they Eric was sent home. They had a car pick up Eric, and they called everyone out to all the crew, and they called a big meeting, and the head of the studio came in, and they said, we have good news and bad news. The bad news is that Eric Stoltz was just let go from this film. And the good news is that we replaced him with Michael J. Fox. And so someone called out from the crowd, it sounds like it's just good news then. That was the night that Eric Stoltz was let go from Back to the Future. In a nutshell. It's in more detail in the book, but that's in a nutshell.
It was a pretty positive reaction from everybody on set.
Positive reaction. And, like I said, it just wasn't working. Eric was miserable. It's like, I don't know if you guys play sports or play an instrument or, what you guys do in terms of talent, but
yeah, both.
It's like, I'm not an athletic person. It would be like if someone said, okay, you're going to play in the Super Bowl this year. And like playing in the Super Bowl is an amazing opportunity. Like I wouldn't turn it down. If someone was going to give me that opportunity, I would absolutely do it, but it wouldn't be a good fit, for me. Or here's another way of that I like to sort of describe it to people. Not all roles are right for all people. So if you had cast, Meryl Streep in Bridesmaids, it probably would not make for a very entertaining movie. And no one would doubt that Meryl Streep is a fine actor. It just wouldn't be the best part for her. And I think that's just the situation that Eric Stoltz found himself in.
Is there anything out there? Did he have a sense of relief afterwards? I mean, I've been in positions where I've worked at jobs and had, been in spots where like I hated it and I sucked at it. And then afterwards been like, shoot, it's just so much better to be done with that.
Well, lucky for Eric, immediately after he was let go, he had no recollection of having ever been there. So I have no idea.
Even better.
I have no idea whether or not he was upset or not. I think maybe they did one of those like Men in Black, like memory eraser.
Yep. There you go.
He doesn't even remember that he was there. He sees photos of himself and he thinks like a carnival ride, sort of thing. I have no idea. I have no idea what Eric thinks. And, I spoke with Bob Gale and I spoke with Bob Zemeckis about the footage. Everyone wants to know about the footage. Will they ever release any footage of Eric Stoltz? And Zemeckis said to me, he doesn't really think that footage will ever surface because there's, Michael's performance is so iconic. There's nothing that anyone will ever do besides say, wow, Eric Stoltz was really bad in Back to the Future. And he doesn't really feel like that's fair to Eric. Again, Eric wasn't responsible for his casting. Bob Zemeckis was. And Sid Sheinberg, if you want to go that far. And so for the footage to be released and have the public just sort of talk about how bad the footage is would only make Eric look bad when Eric really was not responsible for it. So it probably isn't going to see the light of day.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense that they would do that to not make him look bad, but also to not take away from Michael J. Fox's performance, which is the highlight of his career by far.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So, although there's money in releasing that footage and letting Stoltz actually tell his story, should it happen to come back to him.
Listen, if Eric Stoltz is listening, and I like to have this, I have this fantasy that Eric Stoltz closely follows everything Back to the Future. I have this fantasy that he's read the book, that he has it like highlighted and like he has like notes in it. That he listens to the podcast, that he's like watched all the special features. Like these are like my fantasies. And so, Eric, if you are listening, I am happy to let you tell your story. I mean, I think it's fast. It's an amazing piece of Hollywood history. Never had there been that much footage shot for a film and then have the lead actor fired and recast. Never in the history of Hollywood. And so, there had been people that had been hired for parts and then, either had, passed away or something like that, or that had been let go from a project before they started filming or after like a day of filming. But he shot for 6 weeks. And so that's quite a feat.
Yeah, that's crazy. Let's talk a little bit about the DeLorean, which is such an iconic part of not only the film, but pop culture, cinema history. From reading your book, this was not actually the first choice for their time travel device. Can you talk a little bit about the initial idea and what else they had in mind?
Yes. So the initial idea was just sort of like a chamber, and what they realized, like almost like a giant refrigerator sort of thing. And if you think about it, a refrigerator is immobile. Like there's an inherent problem with that.
Right.
And so they ended up having to like cart this time machine chamber around on the back of a pickup truck, which no one really thought made for very cinematic movie making. It wasn't a very beautiful aesthetic.
Yeah.
And the DeLorean at the time, a lot of people don't realize the DeLorean at the time was already a car that had quite a notorious reputation. John DeLorean was already in jail, I believe, at the time the film was made. And so the car was not being, was not in production. And it was a car that was not only stylish, but also was a little bit dangerous, notorious. And so it ended up being a good fit. And obviously they were able to get that great spaceman from Pluto gag out of just like the futuristic look of the car.
Yeah.
And so, it's impossible today to see a DeLorean and not think of Back to the Future. The film really has incredibly extended the life of that vehicle. I mean, who knows if we would even be remembering the DeLorean today if it weren't Back to the Future. It might be like Ishtar or some other like flop that just has like exists in the annals of pop culture.
Yeah, and it is so iconic too. And if you compare it to other time travel movies, especially like Bill and Ted, it's like who necessarily thinks or jumps out of their boat to see a phone booth, but you see a DeLorean come down the road and you lose your cool.
Yeah,
it's like all hands on deck. Come look at this shit.
If you can actually get a DeLorean up to 88 miles per hour, God love you, because they're actually not very good cars. So I know I've heard of people that have like crapped out their DeLoreans trying to actually get it up to 88. They're just not built. They're bad cars. They're just not very good cars.
Yeah. Can you even imagine that line coming from Doc Brown? He's like, when this refrigerator hits 88 degrees, we're going to see some serious shit.
Chris Lloyd can sell anything. He could probably do it. But believe me, a DeLorean. What I can't imagine him saying is if you're going to go back in time, why not do it with some style? Because you can't go back in style in a chamber on the back of a pickup truck.
Yeah, that doesn't work at all. So the film comes out. It's a massive box office success. We've covered that in a previous episode that we're going to put out a day before this one. They spent 24 weeks in the top 10. Critically, it's well received across the board. So, Casein, when do they start talking about part 2?
Well, they start talking about part 2. I'll say they being the studio wants a part 2 almost immediately. And Bob Zemeckis, and he's talked about this on the special features, and we had a great conversation about this for the book. But he said, he really hates doing sequels. Sequels it's almost impossible to please people with a sequel because people want a different film, but they want not too different. And most importantly, when you sit down to write a movie, maybe this is different now in 2018, especially in the age of, all of these Marvel films but, when you sit down to write a movie, you are trying to tell a complete story. Back to the Future comes to a conclusion. The ending of the film, when they put Jennifer in the car and say, you have to do something about your kids, was just supposed to be like an ironic joke that Marty had went back to resolve an issue with his parents, and now he had to go resolve an issue with his kids. It wasn't really meant to tee up for a sequel. But because the movie was so successful, they really wanted the Bobs to do a sequel, Bob Zemeckis and Bob Gale. At the time, Zemeckis was working on Roger Rabbit, doing pre-production for Roger Rabbit. And he said, well, the only way that I would do this sequel is if we go back and revisit the first film. Our film is about time travel, and we have a very unique opportunity here to go back and look at these things that occurred in the first film from a different perspective. So we're, if you loved the first film, we're going to offer you kind of an alternate version of that first film. if you really are into change, we're going to offer you big change by showing you 2015. And so that was sort of the thing that excited them. Zemeckis especially, both of them, but Zemeckis especially was really excited about doing this thing that had never been done in any sequel to date. I mean, now the thing that immediately comes to my mind is I don't know if you've ever seen Lion King 1.5, but I mean that's one thing that comes to mind where like they did a very similar sort of looking at the events of the Lion King animated film, but through a different perspective. This was really the first time that had been done, and so they wrote this very long script for a movie called Paradox, and it was essentially what has since become Back to the Future Parts 2 and 3. And the movie was just it was going to be too expensive and too long. It was going to be about 3 hours or so. And so they went to the head of the studio, and Universal had just done Howard the Duck, actually, and Howard the Duck was a massive flop, and they were not about to spend a lot of money on something that was not a certainty. I mean, no movie is a certainty, of course. And so Sid Sheinberg was able to be convinced that why not take the movie script, rip it in half, extend it so that you have two 2-hour films, and then just sort of make both films one after the other so that you would sort of be able to keep the cost of your sets and even your crew, and sort of, you'd be able to sort of amortize a lot of the cost. And so they did that, and they filmed Back to the Future 2, and then they took a 2-week break, and then they filmed Back to the Future 3 immediately after, and the films were released within less than a year of each other.
Is that the first time that you know of that Hollywood had ever done a film that actually filmed back-to-back like that?
Done one other time with a sequel to The Three Musketeers, but besides, I think this was only the second time it was done. And now, of course, I don't know how much it's done today, but certainly, going back maybe 10 years or so ago, it was done all the time with the Lord of the Rings films and things like that. The Harry Potter films, it seems, unless I'm incorrect on this, it seems like that slowed down a little bit. That was a big trend in Hollywood after Back to the Future for some time.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's an opportunity to save money on cast and crew and sets, like you said. And I know some movies still do it, but I think you're right. I mean, we're getting away from that a little bit in Hollywood, especially as movies are starting to get a little bit cheaper to make digitally and the tax breaks are increasing.
Yeah, and if you look at, even, I didn't notice it as a kid, but now certainly as an adult, I mean, I can see that Michael J. Fox looks older in the sequels. I think now there's such a you don't want your stars to age out, and audiences are just so savvy now. And of course, there's home video. These things are going to they're going to last in a way that people did not anticipate them lasting even 40 years ago. And so there's HD. There's an incentive to kind of retain the quality control is what I'm getting at, by making these films concurrent as opposed to coming back and making a movie 5 years later. And in fact, it brings me to a point. Christopher Lloyd had an incredibly hard time making part 2, especially because, Doc Brown's performance was so iconic. And if you think about it, some of those scenes he was filming for the third time, rather. He had filmed them with Stoltz in part 1, then filmed them with Michael J. Fox in part 1, and then was filming them in part 2 from a different perspective. And so, he was just concerned that he wasn't going to be able to match the same level of intensity in his performance. I mean, ultimately, I think, he did a fantastic job in the sequels, but he was concerned about how much time had passed between the first one and the second one. And so, the actors were very happy to do the films back to back.
One of the questions I wanted to ask this a little bit earlier, but let's talk about George McFly for a second, played by Crispin Glover. Did you have any interaction with, even his representatives or anything else that maybe the Bobs mentioned about Crispin and, just not having him for the next two films?
Oh yes, there's a lot in the book about Crispin and why he's not in the next two films. I had the pleasure of speaking not only to the Bobs, but also Jeffrey Weissman, who's the actor who replaced him, and for the sequels, and also the other actors and other filmmakers. You know, Crispin was someone that the actors all loved working with. Chris Lloyd, Lea Thompson, they all loved working with Crispin. The crew really did not love working with Crispin because Crispin was eccentric. And so there's one there are a couple little stories. For example, I'll tell you two quick little stories. One that Lea told me, and it's in the book, and it sounds so incredibly unbelievable. It's true. Crispin was very concerned that his character at the end of the movie be a different character. You know, the new, you know, the McFlys that were living a better life. He really wanted to get in character for this. And, you know, he was concerned that he wouldn't be able to do it. So he invited Lea over to his house to go through the script and read through things. And so when Lea gets there, his house, or his apartment rather, is painted entirely black. Not just like including the ceiling. Like everything is completely black. And there is no furniture in the house at all except for a gynecological examination table.
Jeez.
And so Leah's like, you know, this is your place, this is where you live, and he's like, oh yeah, you know, I just like to keep it minimalist. And she's like, all right, well so, you know, we're gonna go through the script. And so he said, well, I really think that because the McFlys are now, you know, in a better relationship, it would be better if we just did something that was a bonding experience. So I got a canvas and I thought we could maybe paint something together. And that's how we'll sort of get into character. And so the two of them painted a volcano. And then, like, after they painted the volcano, she was like, do you want to go over the script? And he's like, no, I feel like I'm pretty good. And then she went home. And that was it. And so that, you know, this, if you're an actor and you're not responsible for the well-being of the film, you can sort of deal with Crispin's eccentricities. You know, if you're one of the producers and time is money, you know, and Crispin is, you know, having odd behavior on set or difficult behavior on set, it isn't really something that's tolerated quite so much. When it came time to do the sequels, Crispin really wanted, you know, everyone, of course, knew that the movies were an amazing success, and Crispin wanted what he felt he was deserved as being one of the stars of the movie. You know, of course, he was one of the stars of the first film. So he wanted what Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd were getting for the sequel. At the time, the script had not been written yet. And so Bob Gale, who was doing the lead negotiating, refused to pay that. And they just could not. It was one of those things where Crispin really didn't want to do the movie all that much. He felt like if I'm going to do it, I at least should be compensated for it. He felt like he had been really mistreated by the crew. They had done some cruel things to him, in his view, over the course of filming. The crew really didn't want to work with Crispin again. And so they found a workaround, which was hiring someone who resembled Crispin enough and then putting him in facial appliances to mask the fact that it wasn't Crispin.
Wow. Yeah, and I know he ends up getting a pretty good payday from that, didn't he?
He did. He ended up getting exactly the amount that he wanted to be in the film.
So they had been better off just to go ahead and put him in it, not fight it.
Or not.
Yeah, or not.
It's hard, you know, it's hard to say because they did not pay Jeffrey Weissman very well. And so did they get Crispin, you know, did they save themselves the headache? You know, you could argue that by being sued, they caused a headache, but they also would have endured someone that they really had a bad experience working with on the first film. And so, I guess bad is a fair way of putting it. I was going to sort of pretty it up a little bit, but the people that I spoke with basically said that Crispin was, a real challenge to deal with on the first film.
So I think the real question that our audience is going to want to know is, where is the painting of the volcano at?
Oh, wow. I don't know.
I want to see it.
I don't know. I'm doing a convention that Lea Thompson is at in August. Maybe if I see her, I will ask her if she
Yes,
knows
please do.
If I do, I'll try and get her on video. I'll tag you guys if she gives me an answer.
Perfect. And then if you ever re-release the book, there's your next cover.
Yeah,
The volcano.
just the. I mean, could you imagine how interesting? I mean, but it's moments like these that make me go, like, truth is stranger than fiction. That's why I love writing nonfiction books. There are just so many great stories of things that actually happened. If this were fiction and I said that story, people would say, "What do you mean his apartment's all black and he had nothing but a medical examination table and they painted a volcano?" But it's a true life story. True story.
Wow, that's an awesome story. So, Casein, how do you personally rank the Back to the Future films in terms of which ones you personally enjoy?
Oh, don't ask me that.
Kyle, you asshole.
So here's the honest truth. I think Back to the Future, the first one, is almost a perfect film. It is beautifully shot. It is beautifully structured. It moves at a great pace. It's like there is no denying that Back to the Future is the best from a filmmaking standpoint of the three. However, I do really love part two. And I love it just because I love the ambition of it. I mean, I just think there's so much movie packed into that movie. I love it. And it's so ambitious. And if you think about it, it's ambitious when they didn't have to be ambitious. The first movie was really, really successful. They could have done the exact same thing, and in fact, there was an early version of the script that you may know about that, where they go back to the late 60s.
Yeah, 60s.
And it's almost the same movie. I mean, it's obviously different enough, but it's almost the exact same movie. And they could have made that, and I'm sure it would have made a lot of money. But they chose to do something really, really bold and really ambitious. And I just think it's such a creative story. It's an imperfect movie, but if you said, like, if I were teaching, like, a screenwriting course or something, I don't know how you can talk about Back to the Future without really spending some time on part two. And to be honest with you, one of the things that I've heard people say about the book is that I didn't really spend enough time on part three. And I can understand people's sort of critique of that. But just from my perspective, part three is a simpler film. So if you're writing about, the weird behind the scenes stories or the history of it, part three is a very straightforward movie. There aren't a lot of intricacies to that particular film because it's a Western. Part two is just filled with intricacies, and I think it's beautifully manic. Part two.
Yeah, that's such a cool way of putting it. And so many sequels fall victim to the exact opposite of that. Like, Kyle and his wife recently did a review of Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom.
It's
and
horrible.
as this, what?
It's horrible. I saw it a couple days ago. I thought it was complete trash.
Same here. And it takes all of the elements that the original story of Jurassic World does and just repeats them for the sake of familiarity, to be like, it's like eating the same food, but instead of, you just use a different kind of ketchup.
Yeah. Oh, now I have to ask you both. So Kyle and JD, how do you rank them? Now I'm putting you on the spot.
I'll go first. I go 1, 3, and 2. And the reason I like 3, for whatever reason, growing up, we only had Back to the Future 1 and 3. I don't know why my dad didn't buy number 2, but I didn't watch that movie as much, so I kind of fell in love with 3 because it was when I got tired of watching number 1, it was a good second option outside of Ghostbusters or whatever else I was getting into at that point. So yeah, I do like the Wild West Back to the Future.
did you know what was going on? Like, did you get a good? I can't even imagine just seeing 1 and 3. Like, did you know what had happened in 2? I know they do that
yeah.
recap.
Yeah, every once in a while, we would go to the Blockbuster and I would rent it and watch it. Yeah, for whatever reason, we just never had 2. It'd make a lot of sense. JD, how about you?
So I'm going to be a traditionalist. I'm going to say, well, I did as a child love the third movie. I love the Wild Wild West elements, but having seen it again as an adult, I have to go part 1 and 2, and then I'm going to leave a blank spot for a future movie, and then I'm going to say part 3 comes in 4th place. Wow. And the reason I love everything that Casein said, because part 1 and 2 is kind of like a boomerang. You throw it out and you have the first movie and it's a beautiful throw, and then it returns back to you and it sort of finishes up that story arc in a really cool way. And the third movie to me just always seems like a separate adventure and I never understood like how these families were still in the same area for so many years and still picking on each other for hundreds of years. It just seems to me a lot of it was too convenient for the sake of comedy, which I love, but from a storytelling perspective, I have to push it off a little bit.
I love that I love that. And it's funny because as a kid, I really liked the device of like Marty being called chicken and the way that he responds to that. And I really, that whole thing, the way that it ties up in part 3, like it really resonated with me. And as an adult, it just makes me cringe so much. Like it really does. It's like I understand why it's added in the movie, but it's completely devoid of the character as he is in part 1. There never was that sort of that device. And Marty in part 1 is so much cooler than he is in 2 and 3. Do you guys agree with me on that? I mean, like, I feel like he's in part 2 and 3, that he grows up to be like this loser who's taken advantage of by his boss, who's sort of swindled into getting into these situations, who has the encounter with, needles and things like that. There are all of these things that sort of make you question, Marty's coolness. Whereas in the first movie, I thought that Marty was just like absolutely cool, lying about going up to the lake with his girlfriend and playing rock and roll. And, it just seemed like he was just like a suaver character. I think that there were some changes made for, to use your word, convenience of storytelling for the sequels that, again, on repeat viewings are clear that and as a kid, I don't think I noticed them as much.
So, Casein, I'm going to read some audience questions for you from our listeners on Twitter and Instagram. So, awesome. First one comes from the Upside Down podcast. Clearly, that's a Stranger Things podcast. Yes. And they want to know... Anti-gravity podcast. They would like to know, how do they feel knowing that this story is cross-generational, the cast and crew?
Gosh, they love it. I mean, everyone that I've spoken to loves the fact that this film resonates with kids and adults and even grandparents. I mean, when this film came out in the 1980s, in 1985, it perfectly hit in that kind of 50s nostalgia boom, Happy Days, Grease, we were still sort of, even, Nick at Night was kind of getting started. We were in this era of loving to look back at the 50s in a way that now we're kind of loving to look back at the 80s. And so Back to the Future has always had that kind of cross-generational appeal. And even now, that when I do these conventions or talks at libraries or museums or whatever about Back to the Future, there are always children. And when I ask the kids, what do you love about the movie? They say, well, I love the hoverboards. I mean, that was my answer 30 years ago about why I love the movie. I love the car. I love the, it's amazing. This is so corny, but it's just a true answer. But it is corny, I know. But it's amazing that this film about time is so timeless. It's so dated. It's so steeped in the 80s. And yet, because it's about time travel, the fact that it's so of the 80s almost just makes it seem like we're going to the 80s as a time period. Not like this is a film that's current or that's trying to be current. Do you get what I mean? Kids today can see the movie and just sort of feel like it's no different. The 80s in part one is no different than the 50s in part one. It's just this sort of cinematic interpretation of a time period. And the filmmakers all share this sentiment. They, literally, I think the last sentence of the book is, I pose this question to Zemeckis, and Zemeckis said, it's mission accomplished. I think that's literally the way that I ended the book. So they certainly feel like it's mission accomplished.
And that's a really great point that you make about talking about the difference between watching this movie in current day and watching the movie in the 80s and then referring back to the 50s. I mean, the movie itself is a time capsule of the time that it was created. And so I love the idea that you are jumping in the DeLorean, and this is what we do with our podcast every week. And that's why I love what we do with our podcast, because we put ourselves watching a movie in the time when the movie came out. And if you can do that, I think that's the point that the filmmakers really would love to drive home. And that makes movies, like you said, timeless.
Yeah. And it's why there are so few films like Back to the Future that really hold up. I write about film all the time, of course, and sometimes things are so current. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, these Marvel films, and I think that the Marvel films are by and large good. I'm not crapping on the Marvel film, but these Marvel films are all so incredibly contemporary that we're not going to be watching them in 30 years from now. I mean, maybe we will, actually, because it's kind of unique what they're doing with the structure of them. But, there's going to be something that feels very dated about them, unlike, these films that have kind of a classic aesthetic. I don't know. Maybe I'm being like an old man going like, back in my day, movies were better. I mean, maybe that's what I'm doing a little bit. But I just think there is something not trying to make something too contemporary. And I think Back to the Future, even when they were depicting the 80s, still managed to make it kind of like a cinematic 80s in a way that Stranger Things does so beautifully. Since the Upside Down podcast asked the question, Stranger Things really captures this, where it's a fantasy version of the 80s, not the actual 80s. I don't know if any of this is making sense. It makes sense to me.
No, I follow you 100%. And, to me, it sort of is like John Updike's short story A&P, where it takes that slice of life and defines it, and then it exists.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, so part 2 of their question actually deals with this, and I think they're just wanting your opinion. But it's rumored that Back to the Future will play some role in Stranger Things Season 3, because it's going to take place in 1985, the year of the film's release. And they're just saying it will expose a whole new group of fans to Marty and Doc, and it's the story that keeps on going. So is that something you would be looking forward to seeing in that television show?
I love Stranger Things. I love Back to the Future, and I love the 80s. So absolutely. And I think that what they do with Stranger Things and the way they weave in popular culture is so it feels so natural. It feels natural, like when I was growing up in the 80s. I don't feel like I'm watching a throwback to the 80s. I feel like I'm actually in the 80s watching TV. And so I trust they would do a good job working some Back to the Future.
And I've got one more question, comes from @PhantomDarkDave on Twitter, who wants to know, were there any loose ends left open for another film?
They intentionally smashed the DeLorean to bits.
Exactly.
They intentionally, even though they then made an animated series and they then did, they did other things, but they intentionally wanted to end it. Zemeckis talks about how there's power in threes. I'm actually wearing a Schoolhouse Rock shirt right now, and so 3 is a magic number, of course, comes to mind. But there's something divine about a trilogy. There's something triumphant about a trilogy. They also just didn't, they never wanted to make 3 in the first place. They barely wanted to make 2. They thought it was a unique opportunity to make the second one, and then the script just ran long and they didn't want to cut anything out. So they split it into 2. But by the time they were done, they had spent a long time in the world of Hill Valley. You know, Michael J. Fox had gotten married and had children. You know, there was just a lot that was going on. And so they actually, wait, I'm not entirely sure that he had children. He might have, but I don't want someone to say, wait, he didn't have children at the time. So he had definitely gotten married then filming the first one. He might have had children as well by that time. I don't remember off the top of my head. Okay. But just people were in different places in their lives. And so everyone was kind of ready to move on to other projects.
So, and we just had a couple questions for you. You know, outside of the Back to the Future franchise, what are some of your other favorite films?
Well, I wrote a book on Pee-wee Herman, and I love Pee-wee's Big Adventure. I also wrote a book on The Dark Crystal. I love Jim Henson. I love The Muppets. I love Little Shop of Horrors. I mean, I'm stuck in the 80s a little bit in terms of my thinking right now, but there are movies I love besides the 80s. Let's see. I love a lot of movies. It's really hard for me to say. If I had to say some of my favorite films, I love Taxi Driver. I love Christopher Nolan's Memento. I love the Dark Knight films. I love Gremlins. There's a lot of films that I really, really love and hope to have the opportunity to spend some time exploring, whether it's through writing or just talking about. I think I told you, but I wrote an oral history on Howard the Duck, which is so nuts. And when I did it, I was like, I hope people read this, and people loved it, which was great because I really love Howard the Duck just from when I was a kid. I just was fascinated by it. And so there was this movie theater up in Boston that was doing a double feature of The Dark Crystal and Howard the Duck. And I contacted them and said, you're never going to believe this, but I am uniquely suited to introduce this double feature. I have no idea why you're showing these two films back to back. I have no idea what the through line is. But I went up to Boston and I introduced The Dark Crystal and Howard the Duck. And I couldn't believe that I was standing on stage, sharing fun facts and trivia about Howard the Duck. You know, there was a little 4-year-old me that was going I can't believe this is what I grew up doing. It's just bizarre, but I love it.
So you just mentioned you just put out The Dark Crystal, The Ultimate Visual History last year or earlier this year?
It was last year.
Last year, okay. So what's next for you in terms of what else you want to cover and any other films you want to get into at some point?
Ooh, well, I will say in terms of film, I don't have an actual. Well, there are always things that I want to cover. I'm really into fascinating stories, and so, like I said about Back to the Future, it wasn't just that I loved the film. It was that I also really loved the story of the making of the films. But there's another project that I am working on that I actually can't announce, but I can announce really soon. I hate when people do this but it's actually true. It's actually really true. So if you follow me on social media, I'll be talking about it very soon. But I will say it's actually not about a film. It's a nonfiction. It's a behind the scenes story, but it's in a little bit of a different direction. And I, like I said, am really into interesting stories about popular culture. They don't just have to be about film. And so this is a little bit different for me, but I don't know about you guys, but back when Behind the Music was on, or E True Hollywood Story, I could watch E True Hollywood Story about pretty much anyone as long as the story was interesting. I was there for it, even if I didn't know who Leif Garrett was or something like that. So it's a little bit of a different project, but if you're a fan of We Don't Need Roads or the Dark Crystal book or any of the other things that I've written, if you like the way that I tell stories, you should want to check it out and follow me on social media for more. I'll be talking about it very, very soon.
I'm really interested to read A Christmas Story. That's on my list of one I want to get from your Amazon links or off of your website, which I'll drop some links in a minute. That's one of the ones I want to see. I'd love to see you cover Monster Squad. That would be a really great story.
Wouldn't that be awesome? That'd be there. You know what? I'm always I used to actually answer this question, but I get nervous about answering this question because I'm afraid that before I have a chance to do it, someone else will go, well, that's a great idea. And they'll do it. But I will say, because I know someone else is already working on this book, so I have no problem saying it, but I would have loved to have written a book on something like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which I just think is such an amazing film and such an amazing, unique movie that will never exist again because everyone is just, everyone's just a capitalistic bastard, and like they would never be able to get all those movie studios to agree to license their characters. But someone actually is writing a book on the making of Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And so once that book is out, I will be like first to pre-order it. But yeah, the Christmas Story book is really interesting because that book is actually a little bit different than the other books that I've written, because like the first half of the book is really about the making of the movie. And then the second half of the book is really kind of about what it was like for each of these child stars growing up, being known for a movie that they made 30 years earlier that wasn't a success at all. And then, finding themselves to be sort of celebrities and in demand for interviews and conventions and things like that as adults. And, by the time the film had reached success, many of them were even out of the film business. So it's interesting because it's sort of the making of the movie and then also, the aftermath for the creative team. It's a cool sort of book, if I can say so myself. But if you're into a Christmas Story, people that are into the movie have really sort of enjoyed finding out not just about the making of the movie, but also a lot about the actors.
Yeah, I know that's on our list to cover later in the year. We would love to have you back on to talk about that film.
I'd love to. In fact, if you give me enough notice, I might even be able to get you a cast member or two. So just let me know. Done and
Fantastic.
Done. Give me like a month, and I'll. Ian Petrella, who's a great friend of mine, he was the little brother Randy.
Yep.
At a minimum, I'm sure Ian would do it, and I could probably get some other people too. So let's
awesome.
we'll talk offline about it, but we can make that happen, I think.
Okay. Great. And last question that we had, this is back to the Future again, is where do you see the franchise going next?
If there's anywhere for it to go.
Yeah. Well, where we're going, we don't need roads. If there's anywhere for it to go, they have done such a creative job in expanding the universe through comic books and video games, and those are original stories that they're just sort of expanding. For a period of time, they were talking about doing a musical. I don't know if that's ever going to happen. I to be honest with you, I kind of struggle to see what that would look like, but who knows? One thing that they're doing with Back to the Future that I think is just brilliant is that they've been touring the world, doing screenings with these live orchestras playing the score, and I had the pleasure seeing this at Radio City Music Hall in New York, and it was great. I mean, as you can imagine, I've seen Back to the Future a million times by now, and it's after having written a book about it and interviewed, done a bunch of interviews myself and interviewed a bunch of people about it. There are times where you kind of want to take a little break from the thing that you've been working on. But shortly after the book was released, I had the opportunity to go see this, and I was just floored. It was just amazing. I have no interest in seeing a Back to the Future Part 4. I have no interest in seeing a reboot. It's not every once in a while. I mean, I'm sure you guys know, every once in a while, people will post something or, allegedly confirm something. There are all these sort of hoaxes. That's just the wrong direction. I think the right thing to do is find new creative ways to get fans to engage with the films that they already love. And that's why I love doing conventions. I know other authors that hate doing conventions, but there's nothing I love more than doing exactly what I'm doing right now, which is talking with people that love the same thing that I love and being able to trade thoughts and ideas and have a conversation. And you get to do that at these conventions. And so, I'd love to see Back to the Future have more of a presence at those sorts of things where fans can get together. Actually, this is reminding me, I don't know if you guys are familiar with We're Going Back. This was this amazing convention in Los Angeles in, I believe, 2010, and they did it again in 2015.
Okay.
And they literally converted an area of a town's like downtown Main Street area to look like Hill Valley. There were a bunch of actors there. They had people that were able to go hoverboarding, like on a crane rig. It was one of the best experiences of my life. They had an Enchantment Under the Sea dance. You know, a bunch of the actors were there. Tons of fans were there. It was run by the fans. That's something that I would love to see Back to the Future become. You know, take that to major cities across the United States, around the world. You know, if they can just replicate a fraction of what we experienced in that weekend in 2015, I mean, that would just be beautiful.
Yeah, I believe that's featured pretty prominently in the documentary they put out, I think, called Back in Time.
Yeah, the 2010 one was featured pretty prominently, and the 2015 one was like that, like on steroids. It was just it was amazing. It was really amazing, and there were tons of people. Like the editors were there, costume people were there. You know, it wasn't just like the actors. It was all of these people from different aspects of Back to the Future that were there to celebrate these films, and that was just a really, really cool thing.
Yeah, I would definitely love to go to that. Hopefully they'll do that for the 35 years. So a couple more year and a half. Let's do it.
Yeah.
Hey, Casein, anything else you want to plug as far? I know you mentioned an appearance coming up at one of the conventions. Anything you'd like to plug where our audience might be able to find you?
Well, if you're in the, I'm gonna be in Boston and also in Toronto in August. I'll be at Fan Expo Boston and Fan Expo Canada. And so you can find those the information for that on my social media or on the social media for Fan Expo Canada and Fan Expo Boston. Michael J. Fox, Chris Lloyd, Lea Thompson, and Tom Wilson will be at those events as well. So if you have never met them, or if you've met them and just would like to meet them again, that's a good opportunity. And I would say just keep up with me on social media. There's tons of stuff that's going on all the time. I like to post lots of fun pop culture things and love to have these sorts of conversations. So feel free to send me a message or tweet at me or engage with me on Facebook, and we'll stay in touch that way.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. This was awesome. I love talking Back to the Future with you.
Thank you. I had such a great time. This was really fun.
Yeah, man, you were awesome. We appreciate all that you taking some time and discussing some great information, and I know our fans are going to dig this, so really appreciate it.
I hope they find it pretty heavy.
So you can follow Casein on Twitter at Casein Gaines. That's CASENGAINES. We'll be tweeting out the link to his website as well. Go pick up a copy of Where We're Going. We Don't Need Roads. It's such a great read. You'll be supporting Casein in the process. And we're going to look to have him back on hopefully later in the year to talk about A Christmas Story.
Let's do it.
Thank you guys so much for hitting the download button on today's podcast. Reminder, we will be back tomorrow with the full review for Back to the Future. It's episode 50. We have a lot of fun stuff in store for you guys. Again, support Casein Gaines on Twitter. Also his website, CaseinGames.com. You can find links to all his books. As always, make sure you subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, YouTube. It's completely free. Just remember to leave us a 5-star review. That's going to help us grow the podcast. For now, it's time to hop back into our DeLorean, and we will be back tomorrow with the next episode, Back to the Future, the full review. See ya!